History records John Lambert as a heretic who was executed under Henry VIII. That is the official explanation. It is also the most convenient one, because it avoids a far more uncomfortable question. What happens when absolute power runs out of enemies? By the late years of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the charismatic prince history likes to remember. He was older, sick, isolated, surrounded by obedience so complete that contradiction had almost disappeared from his world. Courts no longer argued. Bishops no longer challenged. Silence followed him like a shadow. And silence is dangerous for a king who defines himself by dominance. This was not a period of chaos or rebellion. England was under control. The church had been bent to royal will. Opposition had been removed. Executions had become routine. Fear worked. Order held. What remained was monotony. When power becomes unquestioned, it often seeks stimulation. Not necessarily blood, but affirmation. Proof that it still reaches everywhere, even into the private space of belief. John Lambert entered this moment not as a threat, but as a contrast. He was not powerful. He did not lead followers. He did not challenge the crown openly. What made him visible was simpler. He did not adjust his convictions when authority demanded it. He remained composed, respectful, unmoved. In a system built on submission, that composure stood out. This was never just about doctrine. It was about control over conscience, about reminding an audience, both present and watching from afar. That disagreement itself carried consequences, not because it endangered the state, but because it disrupted the performance of unity. Justice, in this context, was not blind. It was theatrical. A public process was required, something slow enough to be observed, clear enough to be understood, severe enough to discourage imitation. The goal was not resolution. It was demonstration. Lambert was not selected because he was dangerous. He was selected because he was visible, because his refusal could be staged, because his collapse, if achieved, would reinforce a message words alone could not deliver. This was not an execution driven by urgency. It was shaped by atmosphere, by comfort, by a court that had grown too quiet. And in that quiet, a single man became useful. If you want to understand how power turns boredom into brutality and belief into spectacle, subscribe to the channel. This story does not get cleaner from here. Henry VIII did not rule through constant violence. He ruled through expectation. By the later years of his reign, the English court had learned how to survive him. You agreed quickly. You spoke carefully. You avoided standing out. Most importantly, you avoided forcing the king to prove himself. Because Henry could tolerate many things, but being questioned was not one of them. His authority was no longer theoretical. He had broken with Rome. He had reshaped religion by decree. Bishops owed their positions to him. Nobles owed their lives to his moods. Power no longer needed to argue. And yet, that made contradiction more dangerous, not less. When someone disagreed quietly, without spectacle, without rebellion, it exposed a vulnerability. It suggested that authority might be resisted without force, that belief might exist beyond command. John Lambert represented exactly that discomfort. He was not defiant in posture. He was not theatrical in tone. He did not insult the king. What made him unsettling was restraint. He did not rush to align himself. He did not perform submission. He answered carefully and stood by his position. For a ruler whose image depended on unquestioned dominance, that restraint could feel like disrespect, humiliation, in this context, was not cruelty for its own sake. It was correction, a way to restore balance, to remind the court, and anyone listening, that conscience itself existed within royal reach. Breaking a man privately achieves silence. Breaking him publicly reshapes behavior. Henry did not need Lambert erased. He needed Lambert reduced. What followed was presented as a debate. In theory, it was an intellectual exchange, a theological clarification, a demonstration of reasoned authority. But nothing about the structure supported that claim. The setting was controlled. The participants were chosen. The outcome was never in doubt. Lambert stood alone, surrounded by men whose positions depended on royal favor. Bishops spoke with confidence, not because they were persuading, but because persuasion was unnecessary. Agreement already existed. Henry VIII did not lead the discussion. He presided over it. That distinction mattered. Questions were not designed to explore ideas, but to narrow options. Each response was followed by correction. Each clarification became another opportunity to conform. Lambert was not asked what he believed. He was asked whether he would align. This was not theology, it was choreography. The imbalance was visible to everyone present. A common man addressing the king under watchful eyes, guards within sight, clerks recording every word, silence in the room carrying more weight than speech. The goal was exposure, to isolate Lambert's position, to strip it of context, to force it into the open, where it could be judged not by logic, but by loyalty. The bishops played their roles well. They spoke in turns. They reinforced one another. Disagreement was framed as confusion, persistence as stubbornness. Henry watched, not for correctness, but for fracture. The debate did not end with a verdict announced aloud. That absence was intentional. Formally, the matter remained unresolved. Informally, the path forward was clear. The session had served its purpose. Lambert had been placed at the center of attention. His refusal had been witnessed. His isolation had been established. The court had seen what disagreement looked like under pressure. What remained was not discussion. It was decision, and that decision had not yet been revealed. When the formal proceedings ended, many in the hall believed the worst was over. The debate had run its course. The verdict, though harsh, was now clear. John Lambert had been declared a heretic under the laws of the realm. In theory, the next step should have been administrative, a sentence recorded, a prisoner transferred, a case closed. But Henry VIII was not finished. According to contemporary accounts, the king chose to intervene personally after the judgment. This moment has often been described by chroniclers as an act of royal mercy, a final chance offered to a condemned man. Henry addressed Lambert directly. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He offered what appeared to be a way out. If Lambert would recant his beliefs publicly, if he would submit to the authority of the church as defined by the crown, his life could be spared. On the surface, it was a familiar practice of the time. Recantation was a legal mechanism. Many accused heretics survived by using it. But the setting mattered. This was not a private negotiation. It was done before witnesses, before bishops, before courtiers who understood the political theater of the Tudor court. The king was not merely enforcing doctrine, he was asserting final authority. Lambert was expected to speak, to withdraw, to erase his own arguments with his own voice. And yet, he did not. Historical records suggest that Lambert remained firm, refusing to deny his beliefs even when faced with the certainty of death. He did not plead. He did not bargain. In that refusal, the outcome became irreversible. Under Tudor law, once mercy was offered and rejected, the sentence could proceed without hesitation. The responsibility shifted. The crown had shown restraint. The subject had declined it. This was not cruelty outside the norms of the era. It was power exercised within them. Henry VIII did not need Lambert to die in anger. He needed the record to show obedience was possible and resistance was chosen. From that moment forward, Lambert's fate was sealed, not as an act of sudden rage, but as the final consequence of a public decision. The king withdrew. The court moved on. The machinery of punishment resumed its work. Lambert would not be remembered as a man who begged for mercy and failed to receive it. He would be remembered as a man who was offered survival and declined it. And in the Tudor world, that distinction mattered more than mercy itself, because power, once displayed, does not need to explain itself again. The sentence passed on John Lambert was not unusual by the standards of 16th century England. Burning at the stake was a legally sanctioned punishment for heresy, firmly embedded in religious and civil law long before Henry VIII's reign. It had been used under Catholic monarchs and would continue to be used under Protestant ones. And yet, in Lambert's case, the sentence carried a meaning far beyond its legal function. This was not about removing a single man. It was about visibility. Execution methods in Tudor England were never chosen at random. Each carried its own message. Hanging was swift. Beheading was reserved for the noble. Imprisonment allowed silence. Burning was different. It was public. It was slow. And most importantly, it could not be ignored. Chroniclers of the period noted that executions for heresy were designed to be witnessed. Crowds gathered not merely out of curiosity, but because attendance itself was part of the system. Fear worked best when shared. Henry VIII understood this. As supreme head of the Church of England, he ruled a nation still divided in belief. Reformers questioned doctrine. Traditionalists questioned his authority. Both sides watched closely for signs of weakness. Lambert's execution was never meant to resolve a theological dispute. That debate had already ended. The verdict had already been reached. The punishment served another function. It demonstrated that disagreement with the Crown's religious settlement was not an abstract offense. It carried consequences that could be seen, remembered, and repeated in conversation long after the fire was extinguished. Smoke rises, stories spread faster. Importantly, Henry did not attend the execution. Kings rarely did. Distance preserved dignity. Authority did not need to witness its own enforcement. The message was delivered without the king's presence. That absence mattered. It allowed the act to stand as law, not passion, not revenge, not personal cruelty, simply the machinery of order doing what it had been designed to do. To the public, the lesson was unmistakable. You could debate, you could question, you could even be heard. But once the Crown had spoken, refusal carried a cost that no argument could undo. Lambert's death was not meant to be remembered for who he was. It was meant to be remembered for what happened to him. In Tudor England, power did not rely on constant violence. It relied on carefully chosen examples. One man punished in full view could quiet thousands in private. And that was the true purpose of the sentence. Not to kill a body, but to discipline belief. Because fear, once planted, does not require repetition. No one rushed the moment. That is what made it unbearable. According to accounts from the period, the execution unfolded without urgency. The crowd had gathered early. People stood where they could see. Some talked quietly. Others waited in silence. There was no chaos, no panic, no collective outrage. Lambert was brought forward as part of a schedule, not a drama. Officials followed procedure. Guards kept space. The structure stood ready. Nothing about the scene suggested emergency. And that calm was the most disturbing element of all. This was not an execution driven by anger. It was an event that had been normalized. People knew what this was. They knew why they were there, and they knew nothing was going to stop it. Witnesses did not describe screaming. They described watching. Time passed. The crowd did not surge forward. No one intervened. Authority did not need to threaten anyone into silence. Silence arrived on its own. This is where the spectacle became something else. Lambert was not reduced to an enemy in the eyes of the crowd. He was reduced to an example. His presence marked a boundary. What lay beyond that boundary was unthinkable, and everyone understood it instinctively. There was no royal voice, no banner, no proclamation, and yet the crown was everywhere. In the stillness, in the waiting, in the certainty that this would proceed exactly as planned. The execution did not demand attention, it absorbed it. People would later struggle to describe what they felt. Not horror, exactly. Not outrage, something quieter. A realization that the state did not need to shout to be obeyed. It only needed to be watched once. Lambert's suffering did not echo because it was loud. It echoed because it happened without resistance, because the crowd remained, because authority remained invisible and absolute. Henry VIII did not have to be present. England was present for him, and that was enough. John Lambert died, and England moved on. There were no days of mourning recorded, no official reflection, no public reckoning. The machinery of the Tudor court did not pause for a single condemned man. Henry VIII continued his reign as he always had. Treaties were negotiated, feasts were held, marriages were arranged and discarded. Royal proclamations filled the streets with new priorities, new enemies, new loyalties. Lambert's name did not appear again in royal correspondence. That absence is the final act of the story. In the Tudor system, execution was only the visible ending. Erasure was the real punishment. Once the sentence had been carried out, silence followed. Chroniclers shifted their focus. Clergy avoided mention. The court did not debate what had happened, not because it was shocking, but because it was settled. History under Henry VIII was not simply recorded, it was curated. What strengthened authority was remembered. What challenged it faded quietly from view. Lambert did not become a symbol endorsed by the state. He did not receive the dignity of controversy. He was denied even that. What survived were fragments, passing references, marginal notes in hostile or cautious sources, enough to confirm his existence, but not enough to threaten the narrative. And that was intentional. In Henry's England, disagreement was not always answered with argument. Sometimes it was answered with removal, followed by forgetting. The crown did not need to justify itself repeatedly. It needed only to ensure that memory did not turn into momentum. There was no apology because none was required. No remorse because authority does not confess. No correction because the record belonged to the victor. The danger was not Lambert's ideas. It was the possibility that others might remember them. So the lesson endured quietly. Obedience was safety, silence was survival, and dissent, once punished, would not be preserved for reflection. Lambert's death closed a chapter, but his erasure protected the system that killed him. The king's power did not rely on constant terror. It relied on selective memory. That is why stories like this matter. Not because they are dramatic, but because they were meant to disappear. If you want to hear more stories that power tried to bury, subscribe to the channel. History is not as clean as we were taught.